Good morning, Andres. Thank you so much for participating in our 13th annual Global Strategic Infrastructure Leadership Forum.
Great to be here, Norm. Thanks for inviting me, and it's always a great honor to participate.
It's fun to have you. Andrés Gluski is the president and CEO of AES. He's been the president and CEO since 2011. He was the CEO for 5 years before that. During his tenure, Andrés has led AES through a dramatic transformation by focusing on simplification, risk improvement, and I think especially we see innovation. He's led the company through a $5 billion divestiture program, increased the credit rating by multiple notches, and initiated a quarterly dividend for anyone who wants to get involved in AES's stock. And that dividend's grown at an 8% annual rate. Andrés has also overseen the largest construction program in AES history, with more than 5,000 megawatts of new power generation completed. Under his leadership, AES has become a world leader in implementing new clean technologies, including energy storage, wind, solar, and LNG. So it's really, Andrés is also a very generous person with his time and a good friend. And I really think it's wonderful what you're doing with AES as a company. And I know that especially my younger staff people really like AES because of your increasingly green reputation. So you have one of the most global footprints of any U.S. infrastructure company. How do you see the global economy evolving going forward? Are you a sort of a glass is half full or half empty guy? What do you see, Andrés?
Well, I'm congenitally a glass half full guy. So I tend to see opportunities even in crisis. So, you know, the truth is interesting. Our particular business has stood up very well to this crisis. Why? Because mostly we're contracted generation and contracts of 14 years with investment grade companies. So we've seen our business very little affected. And this year, you know, we'll do close to 3 gigawatts of new renewable energy projects. So, you know, we're growing fast, you know, and making a difference on the technology. So when you look at the different economies around the world, you're going to have very, you know, how would I say? I used to work for the IMF, as you know, as an economist. So what I see is that we're in somewhat uncharted waters, and it's been very interesting to see how this develops. I mean, we were very early off the mark with COVID. We actually started working remotely March 1st, you know, beginning of March. And it was very funny because I mentioned it on my earnings call in mid-February, saying that COVID was coming, that we were building up inventories of solar panels, inverters, et cetera, because, you know, this was coming, we wanted to be ready. Stock market didn't like it. Why was I pessimistic? And, you know, this wasn't a problem yet. I was way short of what is actually happening. But at the one hand, you had, quite frankly, supply disruption in the sense that less people are working and producing less. So you had a supply shock. Then you had a huge demand shock as people were laid off. So for example, in the US, you know, unemployment went from very low levels to, you know, mid-teens, you know, almost overnight. So we've never had like a pandemic. And at that time, really, you know, the contractions in some places were 20, 30% of GDP. So we've never had a depression plus pandemic simultaneously. So that looked very negative. But then we've never had the fiscal stimulus we've had. So the US was already running a huge deficit before the pandemic. Now it's running at 15% of GDP fiscal deficit. UK is running 11. So a number of countries have really ramped up their fiscal spending. So that, honestly, nobody could tell you what's going to happen, what's going to predominate, the fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus or the supply and demand shocks. So what have we seen today? Quite frankly, I think the spending in the States has been more effective than some of us thought it would be in terms of bringing people back to work. What you have is like a depression in the services sector, but a pretty good recovery in the physical goods sector. China responded much faster than anybody expected. Asia in general. You know, we have operations in Vietnam. You know, you can count the number of fatalities in Vietnam on one hand. It's a
Right.
country of 90 million people whose biggest trading partner was China. Very poor country. It's actually the poorest country where we operate, with a pretty poor medical system, really, but very disciplined about masks, very disciplined about social distancing. So Asia, I see doing quite well.
Okay.
Europe has come back reasonably well. Big service sector, though. So the biggest decline, Spain, Italy, France. And it has a much older population. See, so
Right.
that's part of the impact. You know, when you talk about the impact of this pandemic, I'd say, you know, if I had to boil it down to two things, it's one, the age of the population is actually the most important. Second, I'd say the discipline with which they take social distancing measures. But the third is really the ability to borrow.
Okay.
So, you know, Europe, the US can borrow, can print money. In fact, you know, especially the States, especially the UK, and that's helped keep things going. So Latin America, what does it have? It has a younger population, less reliance on services, but the problem is, except for Brazil, most of them just can't print money to keep the economies going. So that's the restraint in Latin America really is, you know, that fiscal stimulus. And then the interesting case is Africa, which thus far hasn't been very impacted relative to the rest of the world. But, you know, the average age in Burundi is 16. The average age in Japan is 48.
Wow.
This virus will have a very different impact there. So in a nutshell, what do I see? The States has done somewhat better than expected, I would say. Europe has done somewhat better in terms of controlling the virus. In Latin America, it's mixed, quite frankly. I'm not quite as pessimistic as some people on Latin America.
Good. Appreciate that. That's fantastic. It's a nice tour of the world, and especially, I think, valuable from the perspective of your business experience, your company, and how it's doing. Look, one of the interesting things, Andres, just following your career over the last decade, is how quickly you've made AES into one of the most innovative companies, certainly in the space. And, you know, increasingly, it looks like you're gaining momentum. So in the world, can you talk a bit about how you've done that, and you know, some of the perspectives in terms of how with the future?
Well, AES is interesting among the sort of big electric companies because its DNA is that of a scrappy entrepreneur. So we don't come from like a big publicly owned or even, quite frankly, regulated utility. So our DNA was always scrappy and creative. Now, we weren't technically particularly distinguished. So one of the first thing we did was really have a focus on becoming a good operator. And there were a number of programs we did. We hired very good people. And then, quite frankly, it was very interesting. So about 5 years ago, it finally sort of crystallized what was the future of the sector to me. So we didn't make any huge bets prior to that, but it became increasingly clear that renewables were going to be cost competitive, even without subsidies in many places. Okay. So then we moved into that area. We had some very creative people. We started doing energy storage with lithium-ion batteries 12 years ago, when most people thought it was not going to, you know, didn't have much faith in it. And so we've kind of gotten on this trajectory of doing leading edge things with a very high success rate. And when I think about it, what has been our secret sauce? That we're able to buy small tech leading edge companies and put them on our platforms without suffocating them. Okay. So you don't get a company with, you know, $40 billion in assets buying a, you know, innovative company, say in Boulder, like we did with 20 megawatts up and running, that doesn't usually lose their best people. So I'd say that really has been our secret sauce. So, for example, distributed energy, we bought a company with 20 megawatts up and running 3 years ago. This year it'll do 500 megawatts. That's we in energy storage, we teamed up with Siemens to have a global sales force with our technologies. This year we'll sell $1 billion of energy storage batteries in 22 countries. When it comes to digital, in terms of digitizing energy efficiency. We bought into and helped grow a company that's today Uplight that reaches 100 million American households and companies.
Really?
It services 85 electric and gas utilities. And just to give you an idea, it's the biggest seller of nests in the U.S., bigger than Amazon. Wow. So, when you think of these, none of these businesses really existed 5 years ago. And so what we're seeing is also that how we can bring things together. It's like AI, energy efficiency, and then new ones. So just recently we bought, part, because we're never full owner of these companies, into a company called 5B in Australia, which is prefab solar. And it's very interesting because the basic concept is you ship panels packed together, but then you open them up like an accordion. Okay. And then you use robotics to pin them down. And you can build this in a third of the time it takes a normal solar farm. But in addition, you double the energy density. So it means I need half the land to, say, put in 100 megawatts that we did before. And so, what we're seeing is, everybody loves solar farms until you have a lot of them in your county. And then suddenly siting them becomes difficult, right? Right. So if we can make it more dense, it alleviates that problem. You can site it much closer to where the demand is. So, for example, prefab solar combined with energy storage, and we're also getting to prefab energy storage, is a game changer. So this company is involved in some very interesting projects. One is to have a 5 gigawatt, and for most people, 5 gigawatts is like it'd be like a medium-sized state in the U.S. Demand, right, in the outback of Australia, and then through an undersea cable supply Indonesia and Singapore. One of my dreams is to actually get the prefab franchised in India to speed up the adoption of solar in India, and therefore avoid the building of a lot of coal plants in India. So if we can do that, I mean, it's in India, land is very scarce, and so this would be a fantastic, I would say, contribution to greening the world. So, for example, India can't take on the amount of renewable energy that they're building without energy storage. Right. So we had the first grid-scale energy storage in India, in Delhi, to really be a demo. So it's a very exciting time because, again, those are physical assets, right, but then you combine it with AI and energy efficiency, and I really think it's going to be a game changer.
That's phenomenal. That's a nice story too, because I think one of the problems, at least when I talk to people and myself, it's hard to sort of build an architecture in your mind of what's going to happen in the future. I remember talking to you probably 3 years ago, and you said, look, stuff that I thought was going to take 5 years to happen is now happening in 6 months. And so it's hard to look at the future when the future's coming at you that fast.
Yes, no, it's a good point. And sometimes you really do have to study the science. That's what I'd recommend the CEOs and people involved, because there also tend to be a little bit of sort of urban myths. So I'll give you one, like say right now, green hydrogen. And I believe in green hydrogen for transportation. Okay. But the fact is that because why? Batteries are heavy. It doesn't make sense to have an 18-wheeler hauling a massive amount of batteries around. Hydrogen is much better, and it will satisfy that. But having said that, people say, well, you won't need batteries for energy storage on the grid because you have green hydrogen. Well, but just sit down for a second and look at the physics. How much energy do you lose between, say, your solar or wind and cracking the hydrogen? Yeah. How much do you lose compressing it and keeping it cryogenically? How much do you lose transporting it? How much do you lose in the combustion back to a steam turbine to create energy? Well, you probably lose 50%. Okay. A battery will lose 15% at the most inefficient. So, I believe in green hydrogen, but it's not going to solve the energy storage problem with the technology we have today. So that's what I'm saying. But what happens, what I am concerned is that sometimes people think, well, that's coming, therefore I won't invest in today's technology. And that is a problem that you have in a lot of markets.
So one of the last question, and there are some questions from the audience, but I wanted to get a sense from you of you've been talking about energy storage. You have a really interesting joint venture with Siemens. How's that going, and where is that going?
Well, that is the market leader. I mean, we're in 22 countries. We have a backlog of probably almost $1.5 billion of orders. And we're finding more and more applications. So it's a little bit like a hammer. You know, it can do a lot of things. So, you know, you can put it next to solar, for example, and create truly 24/7 renewables. Because that's another myth. People say, well, I'm 100% renewables. Well, most likely you're not. Most likely you're overbuying or overproducing renewables in certain hours, but then you're actually using fossils or others to provide energy when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. Now, what we did in Hawaii was really the first 24/7. So you overbuild the solar, so have 5-hour batteries, which 5 hours means that's at full dispatch. So just to say, if you dispatch it at 50%, that's a 10-hour battery, you see? So we were really able to provide Hawaii with 24/7 load following renewables. So that's becoming a reality. So that I think is very important because, you know, let's get past sort of the headlines and you want to be 100% renewable, really 24/7? How do you engineer that? So I think with the batteries, that really is the future because you can do that. You can have it just standalone. You know, the truth is it's much more efficient than a gas plant for peaking. Why? Because gas plants are online maybe 10% of the time. So that means, you know, you get a surge in demand, you dispatch your gas plant. But batteries are online 99.9% of the time, and they can go positive and negative. So it can do, you know, power plants can't suck out energy from the grid. So it's much better at stabilizing. Its reaction time is instantaneous because you don't have to heat them up. You can locate them anywhere because they don't have emissions. So you know, truly today, in most cases, standalone energy storage is a killer app. It's cheaper and it's just better than, say, peaking plants. But the one area that we haven't touched is transmission.
I was going to ask you about that. So good, please.
Yeah, so we are working, well, we worked with the German government because in Germany you have all this offshore wind. And then you have the big industrial load in Bavaria. So you have to take it from the northwest to the southeast. You have to take it over probably like 1,000 kilometers of old transmission lines. So what's the traditional approach? You have to upgrade the whole 1,000 for your peak load.
Right. Whether
it be 15 minutes, an hour, 5 hours. It's very expensive. Nowadays, to get permits is really what's holding back, you know, new technologies everywhere. Yeah. Well, actually, you can use the old lines if you put a series of energy storage along the way. You basically baseline or basically dispatch at full load your transmission line, and you save it up. So, you know, at different points in the grid, and then you inject it when you need it. So you don't have to upgrade the whole line. You know, it's much, much cheaper. So you save billions of dollars in years in permitting. So just that project, which the German government saw the benefits of it and has an RFP out, and I hope to win some of that, that's probably 6 gigawatts of energy storage.
Oh my goodness.
So the potentials are, you know, tremendous. If we get fleet electrification, well, you know, the grid isn't designed to have 50 buses show up at one depot and get charged up at night. Right. So energy storage can do that, or you have to upgrade the whole grid. So again, I just see the growth. Last year, it grew 400%. Our sales grew 400%. It's just starting.
Your energy storage sales grew 400%.
That's correct.
And what are you allowed to talk about what it looks like it's going to grow this year, or does that get you into trouble?
Well, it's really from sort of 19 to 20. You know, that's what we've said publicly. But you know, the compounded growth rate, you know, the most modest one I can come up with is like 25% a year for the next 5 years. But I think it's going to be more than that.
So you know, you talk about Germany and Europe in the transmission grid. you know, famously, our transmission grid is a real problem, but we have huge amounts of captive wind in the middle of the country, and we're having a heck of a time building transmission lines or getting the electrons out of the generation basins. What are your thoughts there? Because that seems like a huge opportunity for us. Plus, our transmission grid is incredibly old, you know, as it is.
Well, again, I think that rather than just take the traditional approach,
Yeah,
where you upgrade the whole line, think of it more intelligently. And really think like, you know, what parts do you absolutely have to, because there's no transmission to that where the wind's being produced or there's a new client. But how can you optimize the use of the old grid?
okay.
So part of this is a change in mentality of the electric companies. Let's face it. We used to get paid for spending more. You got a rate of return on your investment. Much smarter, quite frankly, is say, can you do it better and allow us to make more money by spending less and providing better energy cheaper? I mean, it's. I remember when I was running a telecom business, and the privatization accord had us burying cables, copper, you know, all over the country, and you had to bury so many cables miles per state. And basically, we went to the regulator and said, look, this makes no sense because nobody can predict 10 years in advance where the demand's going to be. Right. So look, tell us how many new customers you want us to hook up a year. And let us use microwave, let us use fiber optics, let us use different ways of last mile. You know, we probably invested half what the original plan was. So, you know, we could use that in the electric sector in the States.
So that's really interesting as well. One of the things I was trying to figure out is, you know, because famously one of the most difficult things if you're producing solar energy is being able to sell back to the grid. How do you think about that? Is that how does AES look at individual solar providers, even if you're a home?
Yes, look, I think first, you know, the old saying is that the road to hell is paved with the stones of good intentions. So, you know, it's like, okay, we all want to be green. Which is the most efficient way to be green? So the truth is, a community solar is much more efficient than rooftop solar.
Okay.
You know, so first, let's try to get the cheapest solar energy possible. Second, you know, what has happened is there's kind of been a lot of subsidies of, you know, net metering, as it's called. At what price do you sell it back into the grid? So the problem with net metering, if you're buying it back at a very expensive price, you know, it kind of disincentivizes the utilities from promoting it, you know. So what do I think? I think that, you know, we're really getting to the point that renewables don't need to be subsidized. Okay. And have, and we're going to have a much more intelligent grid. So, for example, we're spending a lot on software. So, for example, our energy storage unit, well, a lot of that, the real IP is the design and it's the software. How do you interact? So in the future, there'll be more EVs. They'll essentially be rolling batteries.
Yeah.
And how do you put that intelligently into the grid? So, for example, while they're parked at night, they could be part of an intelligent network's energy storage capabilities. You know, if you have storage in the house, great. But I just think that there tends to be sort of a romantic notion that somehow if you have it on your rooftop, you're saving the planet much more than if, say, you had a community solar, which may be at half the cost per megawatt hour.
This is fantastic. That really is helpful, the whole presentation. So thanks very much, Andres, and congratulations on what you've done. I mean, AES is I'm going to go out and buy stock in AES later on today.
Don't get me in trouble.
Anyway, thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you soon, and good luck and stay healthy. Stay healthy.
Thank you very much. You too.